The sun hung low over the distant ridges as I rode along the rough border of the tribal lands, the weight of years spent chasing shadows and ghosts pressing heavy on my shoulders. When the flicker of movement caught my eye, a figure barely more than a shadow herself, chained to a gnarled post, skin stretched thin over ribs that whispered of starvation, and eyes so fierce and wild they burned through the dusk with a raw defiance that refused to be broken. She was Waya, a young woman whose presence here was a cruel puzzle, a living testament to the brutal mercilessness that had become all too common in these borderlands. And though every instinct screamed caution, the hardened scout in me recognized the unmistakable mark of captivity and suffering, the kind that demanded more than indifference. I dismounted quietly, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve, knowing the dangers this act might bring down on me, for the wild was no place for mercy, and strangers carried their own kinds of risks. With trembling hands, I drew my knife, the steel catching the fading light as I knelt beside her, working quickly to free her from the cruel iron bonds that had stolen her freedom and drained her strength. Feeling the fragile warmth of her trembling skin beneath my fingers as she leaned into the release with a mixture of pain and disbelief, Waya's gaze never wavered, dark, sharp. A storm barely held at bay, and in those eyes I saw a story unspoken, a fury tempered by survival, and a spark of something unyielding that called to the part of me that still believed in fighting for more than just myself. As the chains clattered to the ground, and the cool evening breeze brushed through the trees, the weight of what I had done settled over me like the gathering night. A quiet knowledge that this moment marked the beginning of a journey neither of us could have foreseen, where trust would be hard won, and the wilderness would test the limits of courage and loyalty. I helped her to her feet, steadying her with the strength that had long been honed by years of walking the line between life and death in these rugged lands. And though she was weak, the fierce fire in her eyes told me she was far from defeated. Beneath the vast sky painted with the first stars of night, I realized that freeing Waya was not just an act of compassion, but a choice that would bind our fates together, weaving a story of survival, redemption, and fierce protection that neither of us could yet imagine, but one that would come to define us both in ways deeper than blood or soil. The wild was unforgiving, but sometimes it gave you a chance to rewrite the rules, and tonight, as the cold air settled around us, I felt the first stirrings of something powerful and irrevocable, taking root in the shadow of captivity and the promise of freedom. The ride back to my camp was slow and heavy with silence, Waya leaning weakly against me, her body barely holding itself together. Every breath, a shallow struggle that pulled at something deeper inside me, a mixture of sorrow and determination to see her through the darkness that had nearly claimed her. The wilderness around us was both a sanctuary and a constant threat, the trees whispering secrets in the wind, and the shadows lengthening like fingers reaching for us as the sun dipped low beyond the ridges. But within the rough walls of my cabin, a fragile hope flickered to life as I laid her down on a bed of worn blankets and set about nursing her wounds with hands roughened by years of survival, yet surprisingly gentle in their care. The hunger in her eyes was replaced slowly by something like trust, though Waya spoke little, her dark gaze wary and guarded. A silent sentinel watching for signs of betrayal in a world that had given her little reason to believe in kindness, and every word unspoken weighed heavily between us like the dense forest that surrounded our small refuge. I battled my own ghosts in those quiet days, memories of losses carved deep into my soul, the faces of those I could not save, the loneliness that had become a companion as constant as the cold winds that swept through the mountain passes. And yet in caring for Waya, I found a renewed purpose, a reason to keep fighting beyond mere survival. Her strength, though hidden beneath layers of pain and fear, was unmistakable, a fierce defiance that flickered in the set of her jaw and the stubborn flare of her eyes, challenging the darkness that sought to consume her. As I gathered herbs and fresh water, prepared simple meals, and stoked the fire against the creeping cold, I watched the fragile pulse of life return to her cheeks, a slow bloom of resilience that mirrored the rhythms of the forest waking from winter's grasp. The nights were long and quiet, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant howl of wolves, and in those still hours, the silence between us spoke volumes. A delicate dance of distance and connection, where trust was measured not in words, but in the steady presence of two broken souls, learning to heal together. Every small progress felt like a victory. The first sip of water, the softening of clenched fists, the faintest hint of a smile, and though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, I knew that this was no ordinary rescue. It was the beginning of a bond forged in the crucible of pain and hope, a testament that even in the wildest places, healing could take root if nurtured by patience, courage, and the quiet, unyielding power of mercy. And as the sun rose each day, casting golden light through the cabin's small window, I felt a fierce gratitude for this fragile second chance, not just for Waya, but for myself, and a growing certainty that together we could face whatever the wilderness and the world beyond might throw at us. The night had fallen deep and heavy around our camp, when shadows of the past began to creep into the quiet moments between us. Waya's eyes reflecting a pain so raw it cut through the stillness like a jagged blade. And as she sat beside the fire wrapped in a threadbare blanket, fragments of her story spilled forth tales of mercenaries sent by a rival tribe. Men whose cruel purpose was to break her people's spirit by tearing them apart, dragging her from the warmth of her home, and leaving her chained and starving beneath a sky that seemed as unforgiving as the hatred in their eyes. Her voice was soft but fierce, each word a shard of memory that etched itself into my heart. And as she spoke of the cold chains that bound her and the faces of those who had betrayed their own, I felt the weight of my own ghosts rise within me, the old scars left by losses I had tried to bury beneath years of hard living and endless wandering through a land that offered little mercy. Memories of loved ones lost to sickness, of battles fought and friends fallen. The loneliness that had become my constant companion flickered like embers in the dark recesses of my mind, reminding me that we were both prisoners in different ways, she of her chains, I of my haunted past. Yet in that shared silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant call of a lone owl, a fragile bond began to form, born not just of survival, but of a mutual understanding of the dangers lurking not only in the wilderness around us, but also in the wounds we carried within. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, held a threat that sharpened our senses, a reminder that enemies might be watching from the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness, and that the path ahead was as treacherous as the jagged cliffs that lined the mountain passes. I could see the flicker of fear beneath Waya's defiant gaze, but also a growing trust as she leaned into my steady presence. And in turn, I found strength in the resilience that radiated from her wounded form, a reminder that healing was possible even when the past threatened to consume us. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the determination etched into every line. And as the cold night pressed closer, I made a silent vow to stand between her and the darkness, to face not only the dangers of the wild, but also the shadows of our histories that sought to undo us. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken fears and tentative hope, and beneath the vast, indifferent sky, two broken souls found in each other a fragile sanctuary, ready to face whatever silent threats the dawn might bring. United by the wounds of the past and the promise of a shared future, forged in the fire of survival. The morning light filtered softly through the towering pines as Waya stood beside me, her figure both fragile and unyielding. And when she finally spoke the words that I had waited for with a cautious heart, agreeing to guide me through her sacred tribal lands so that she might return safely to her people, I felt the weight of a fragile alliance settle between us, delicate as the morning mist that clung to the forest floor, yet strong enough to carry us through the uncertain path ahead. The air was thick with unspoken tensions, our worlds colliding in the narrow spaces where cultures met and sometimes clashed, her every gesture a reminder of traditions I could scarcely understand, and my every word an echo of a life shaped by the relentless demands of survival on the frontier. But even in the sharp edges of misunderstanding, there was a growing respect forged in the fires of necessity and shared determination. The land itself seemed to watch us with ancient eyes, its sacred places hallowed and untouchable. And Waya's reverence for the earth and the spirits that dwelled within it was a language all its own, one that I was eager but hesitant to learn, knowing that one misstep could unravel the fragile trust we had begun to build. Our journey through the dense forest was a careful dance of patience and caution, each step a negotiation between her wisdom and my experience. And though the tension simmered beneath the surface like a slow-burning fire, there were moments of unexpected understanding, a glance, a shared breath, a silent acknowledgement of the dangers we faced together. Waya's strength became clearer with each passing day. Not just the fierce will that had kept her alive through captivity and torment, but the quiet courage to face a world that often sought to define her by the chains that had bound her, rather than the spirit that refused to be broken. I began to see her not as a captive or a mystery, but as a woman whose resilience was carved deep into her soul, a warrior shaped by history and hardship, and in that recognition, the walls I had built around my own heart began to crumble. We spoke little of the past and even less of the future, focusing instead on the immediate finding food, avoiding threats, reading the signs left by creatures and men alike, and in that shared struggle, a bond took root that transcended the sharp edges of culture and fear. The nights were filled with quiet moments beneath the stars, where the vast sky seemed to hold our secrets, and the flickering firelight softened the hard lines of survival into something tender and hopeful, as we pressed onward toward her people's lands. I knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges both seen and unseen, but with Waya's strength beside me and the fragile alliance between us, I dared to believe that together we could face whatever storms the wilderness and the world might bring, bound not just by necessity, but by a growing trust that promised something more than survival, a chance at belonging and redemption in a land as wild and unforgiving as the hearts we carried. The morning sun filtered softly through the dense canopy as Waya and I moved deeper into the heart of her homeland, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth, each step carrying us further from the wilderness I had known and closer to a world rich with stories and sacred truths I was only beginning to understand. Waya spoke little at first, her voice low and reverent, as she began to share fragments of her people's history, tales of ancestors who had walked these lands for generations, their lives woven with the rhythms of the seasons, the pulse of the rivers, and the whisper of the winds through the towering trees. She told me of sacred ceremonies held beneath moonlit skies, of songs that carried the weight of memory and hope, and of a profound respect for the land that was not merely survival, but a sacred covenant, a bond so deep it shaped every breath and step her people took. As I listened, my heart stirred with awe and humility, realizing that this culture was not just a backdrop to the harsh frontier, but a living, breathing testament to resilience, courage, and unwavering connection to a world far older and more intricate than I had ever imagined. I found myself drawn to Waya's quiet strength, her unwavering pride in a heritage that had withstood the storms of time. And in that pride, a new kind of loyalty took root within me, a fierce desire, not only to protect her, but to honor the land and people she loved so fiercely. The path we followed wound through ancient forests and across crystal-clear streams, each landmark steeped in stories I was only beginning to glimpse. And Waya's eyes lit with a fierce light as she pointed out sacred sites, ancestral carvings on stones, and the resting places of warriors whose courage had shaped the very earth beneath our feet. With every story shared and every tradition revealed, I felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crumble, replaced by a growing respect for a way of life that balanced strength with reverence, survival with spirituality. There were moments when the weight of history settled heavily upon us, the silence between our words filled with the unspoken understanding that this journey was about more than returning a captive to her people. It was about bridging worlds, healing wounds, both old and new, and forging a bond that transcended the scars of violence and betrayal. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the landscape, I found myself silently pledging to stand with Waya and her tribe, not as an outsider, but as a guardian, bound by a loyalty born from the deepest places of respect and gratitude. The forest around us seemed to pulse with ancient energy, a sacred reminder that the land held stories of endurance and hope. And as I walked beside Waya, I knew that I had become part of something far greater than myself, a living thread in the tapestry of a people whose courage and spirit would forever change the course of my life. The forest around us was alive with whispered warnings that only the keenest eyes and sharpest senses could read. And it wasn't long before we discovered the telltale signs that mercenaries, cold, relentless men, hired to track and capture Waya, were closing in on our fragile sanctuary. Broken branches bent unnaturally, footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, and faint echoes of voices carried on the wind like ghosts haunting the trees, all painting a picture of danger that made Waya's fierce eyes darken with fear, her every movement becoming sharper, more alert, as if the very shadows had teeth ready to snap. I felt that fear gnaw at her. But I also felt something stir within myself, a hardening resolve, forged from years of battling the wild's merciless challenges and haunted memories of losses that had carved deep scars into my soul. Together, we began to prepare, transforming our flight into a fight, learning to move through the forest with a silent grace, every step calculated to blend with the rustle of leaves, every breath measured against the steady rhythm of the earth beneath our feet. We set traps crafted from twisted vines and sharpened wood, cunning snares to catch or delay those who dared pursue us. And in those moments of quiet focus, our fates wove tighter, threads binding us together in a tapestry of survival and trust that neither of us could unravel, even if we wanted to. The wilderness around us became a crucible, testing not only our physical strength, but the endurance of our spirits, the depth of our trust, and the courage to face an enemy that lurked both outside and within the fragile walls of hope we had built. Nights were spent crouched in the shadows, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, the cold biting into our bones, but never freezing the fire that burned between us, a fire of determination and a fierce promise to protect one another at any cost. Waya's fierce spirit, once tempered by captivity and betrayal, now shone brightly in the way she moved, silent, sure, and unyielding as she taught me to read the subtle language of the forest, the signs of danger hidden in the shifting wind or the snap of a twig. And as the days stretched on, I felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on my shoulders, not just for my own survival, but for hers, for the life we were fighting to reclaim from the darkness that sought to snuff it out. The mercenaries' presence loomed like a storm on the horizon, relentless and unforgiving, but in the crucible of the wild, where every heartbeat was a battle and every breath a victory, we found strength in each other, a bond forged in fire and shadow that promised to carry us through whatever dangers lay ahead. And though the path was fraught with peril, I knew with a fierce certainty that we would face it together, bound by more than fate, by a loyalty and courage that no enemy could break. The ambush came without warning, like a sudden crack of thunder splitting the quiet forest air. And in that terrifying moment, the world narrowed to a sharp point where every instinct screamed to protect, to fight, to survive. And when the first arrow whistled past, grazing Waya's shoulder and igniting a flash of pain and fear in her fierce, dark eyes, I knew I had no choice but to throw myself between her and the storm of violence that threatened to end everything we had fought for. My body moved on reflex, years of hard-won survival guiding my every step as I shielded her with my own. The sharp sting of an arrow embedding itself deep in my arm, but drowned out by the thunderous beat of my heart, and the fire of a resolve that refused to break, because losing her was no longer an option. And in the chaos and bloodshed, something unspoken passed between us, a fragile thread of trust, woven from the raw edges of pain and the shared will to live that neither words nor time could yet define. We fought side by side, our breaths ragged and voices swallowed by the forest roar, each moment etching a deeper connection born from vulnerability and fierce protection, a tenderness that softened the hardened edges of past wounds and whispered that survival was as much about the heart as it was about the body. When the last of our attackers fled into the shadows, leaving us battered and breathless beneath the fractured light of the setting sun, I found Waya trembling but alive, her dark eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something new, hope mingled with gratitude, and an unspoken promise that we were no longer alone in this wilderness, or in the battle that lay ahead. Tending to her wounds, my hands steady, despite the pain that radiated from my own injured arm, I felt the weight of that moment settle deep into my bones. A quiet turning point where fear and suspicion gave way to something far stronger. A bond forged in fire and shadow that would hold us together through the darkest nights and fiercest storms. In the days that followed, that trust blossomed slowly but surely, each shared glance and careful touch weaving a tapestry of connection that neither of us had dared to hope for when we first met in the cold grip of captivity and danger. Survival was no longer a solitary fight, but a shared journey, a dance of resilience and vulnerability, where the fiercest strength came from the courage to lean on one another and the willingness to reveal the cracks beneath the armor. As Waya's fierce spirit softened just enough to allow a fragile tenderness to grow, I realized that what we had was more than alliance or necessity. It was the beginning of a partnership that would define not just our survival, but our very souls, a quiet, enduring flame that no darkness could extinguish. And as the forest around us settled into a fragile peace, I held her close beneath the vast sky, knowing that together we could face whatever fires the world would throw at us. Bound by trust, forged in the fiercest of battles, and the quiet strength of hearts intertwined. The day we reached the boundary of Waya's tribal lands, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of history and unspoken questions, and as we approached the council grounds, the guarded eyes of her people fell upon me with a mixture of suspicion and quiet challenge that made me stand taller, though my heart thrummed with unease, knowing well that outsiders were rarely welcomed here without suspicion, especially those who carried the marks of the wilderness like a stranger's cloak. The council elders, stoic and weathered, regarded me with eyes sharp as hawks, voices low and deliberate as they questioned my purpose, my past, and my loyalty. their words laced with caution, born of generations who had learned to protect their people fiercely against all threats. And I met their gaze steadily, offering only truth and the silent promise I had forged with Waya through fire and blood. It was then that Waya, her voice steady and strong despite the fatigue that still lingered in her eyes, spoke for me, recounting the night I had found her broken and starving, the chains that had bound her and the mercy that had freed her. Her words painting a vivid portrait of a bond forged in desperation and survival, a bond that had become unbreakable even in the face of doubt, as she shared how I had risked everything to protect her. I saw the hard lines of mistrust soften just enough, the council beginning to grasp that I was more than an outsider. I was a guardian, whose actions had spoken louder than any claims or defenses I could offer. Yet their acceptance was cautious, tempered by wisdom and the knowledge that the dangers we faced were far from over. Their warnings hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Enemies lurked still, shadows of betrayal and violence that could strike without warning. And the delicate peace that we sought to protect was a fragile treasure demanding vigilance and unity. The weight of their gaze pressed upon me, a solemn reminder that this was not a gift freely given, but a responsibility earned through deeds and sacrifice. And as I stood beside Waya, listening to the council's deliberations, I felt the stirring of a profound respect for a people whose strength was rooted not just in battle but in their deep connection to land, spirit, and kinship. The council's verdict was a turning point. A cautious bridge extended across the chasm of suspicion, offering us a fragile foothold within a community that had known loss and hardship far beyond my own experience. And as we prepared to follow their counsel and face the trials ahead, I understood that this acceptance was both an honor and a challenge, an invitation to prove that my loyalty was as enduring as the ancient trees that sheltered their lands. Beneath the vast sky and the watchful eyes of the elders, Waya and I exchanged a glance filled with unspoken resolve, ready to face the uncertain path together, bound not just by survival but by the promise of belonging, a promise forged in the fire of trust, and the quiet courage it takes to walk into the heart of a new home, where every step forward would be a testament to the strength of love and the resilience of the human spirit. The days that followed our arrival at the tribal village were marked by a growing storm of tension and whispered fears as word spread that mercenaries hired by rival tribes were gathering like vultures on the edges of the land, plotting to crush Waya's people and shatter the fragile peace we had fought so hard to reclaim. The air itself seemed thick with unease, every glance exchanged between the warriors and elders carrying the weight of impending battle, and I knew that to stand beside them meant more than mere words or goodwill. It required blood, sweat, and the willingness to face death head on. So I set myself to the task of learning, shadowing the tribe's skilled warriors as they trained in the ancient arts of tracking, weaponry, and stealth. My body pushed beyond its limits as I struggled to match their grace and precision, each movement a lesson in survival, etched into muscle and bone. Waya watched quietly, her fierce pride shining in her eyes, as she saw me transform from a solitary outsider into someone who bore the mark of their resilience, a man willing to shed his past and embrace the burdens of their fight. The tribe, once wary and distant, began to welcome me into their fold, offering nods of respect and the guarded smiles of those who sense a kindred spirit beneath the skin of difference. With every dawn, as we drilled beneath the towering pines and honed our skills around the crackling fires, the line between outsider and protector blurred, woven together by the shared purpose of defending a people who had given me more than I could have ever imagined: a home, a cause, and a fierce, unbreakable bond with Waya. The lessons were harsh and humbling, and though my muscles ached and my spirit wavered at times, I found strength in the unyielding determination of the warriors around me, in their stories told through scars and quiet glances, and in the knowledge that we were fighting not just for survival but for the soul of a land steeped in history and sacred traditions. As night fell, the village gathered beneath a sky thick with stars. The council of elders, speaking in measured tones about the path ahead and the sacrifices that would be demanded, and I stood beside Waya, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon my shoulders, but also the fierce pride of belonging to something greater than myself. The mercenaries would come, as sure as the rising sun, but we were ready, forged by fire and shadow, into a force that would not yield, and in the heartbeats shared beneath the watchful eyes of the ancestors. I understood that this was no longer just Waya's fight or mine alone. It was the battle of a tribe bound by blood, spirit, and the unbreakable will to protect what was theirs. And I was honored to stand with them, ready to face whatever darkness the world dared to throw our way. The dawn broke with a heavy silence that felt like the calm before a storm, and as the first light seeped through the dense canopy, the distant thundering of hooves and the sharp clash of steel shattered the fragile peace that had settled over Waya's village. The rival forces had come, fierce and relentless, their war cries echoing through the valley as they surged toward the heart of the tribal lands with a single, brutal purpose: to destroy, to conquer, and to break the spirit of a people who refused to bow. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Waya's warriors, my hands gripping a carved wooden spear, heart pounding in rhythm with the fierce battle cries around me, every sense alive with the raw, brutal reality of war, where every step forward was measured in blood, and every breath was a defiant promise to stand firm against the tide of destruction. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and sweat, the ground beneath our feet trembling with the pounding of hundreds of warriors, and as arrows rained down like deadly rain, I moved with a mix of desperation and purpose, fighting not just for survival but for the woman beside me, and the tribe that had embraced me as one of their own. The clash of bodies and the roar of voices created a chaotic symphony that threatened to overwhelm. But amidst the frenzy, I found a fierce clarity, a bond forged in fire and fear that tethered me to these people in a way no words could ever capture. Waya fought with a ferocity that belied her slender frame, her every strike, a declaration that she would not be broken again, and I drew strength from her courage, from the unyielding spirit that had carried her through chains and captivity into the heart of this battle. As the sun climbed higher, painting the battlefield in harsh light, the line between friend and foe blurred in the chaos, loyalties tested by the harshest of fires, sacrifices made in silent moments when a fallen comrade's hand slipped from grasp or a warrior's cry was swallowed by the smoke. I felt the weight of those sacrifices settle heavy on my shoulders, each loss a reminder of the cost of the freedom we fought to preserve. Yet even as exhaustion threatened to claim me, the knowledge that I was no longer an outsider, but a brother in arms to these fierce defenders gave me the strength to push onward, to meet each challenge with the stubborn resolve that had carried me through darker days. The battle raged long and brutal, but as the enemy faltered and began to retreat beneath the unyielding resistance of Waya's people, I knew that my place among them was sealed not by blood alone, but by the valor and loyalty that had been tested and proven on this savage field. As the dust settled and the cries of victory mingled with the mourning of the fallen, I stood beside Waya beneath a sky heavy with smoke and sorrow, feeling a profound sense of belonging that reached beyond the pain and sacrifice, a promise that whatever trials lay ahead, we would face them together, bound by the fierce fire of shared struggle and the unbreakable strength of a tribe united in purpose and heart. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and cedar as I stood among Waya's people, the rhythmic beating of drums resonating deep in my chest like the pulse of the earth itself. And in that sacred moment, surrounded by the tribe's elders and warriors. I felt a profound shift that went beyond the battlefield. Their acceptance was no longer tentative or wary, but a true welcome into a world whose history and spirit had seeped into every corner of my soul. The ceremonies were unlike anything I had ever witnessed, filled with ancient songs and solemn rituals that spoke of honor, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between the people and the land. And as I knelt before the council, their eyes reflecting centuries of wisdom and pain, I understood that I was not just being accepted as an ally or a protector, but being embraced as family, a brother in arms woven into the fabric of a community that had weathered storms, both natural and human. Waya stood beside me, her dark eyes shining with a fierce pride and a vulnerability that mirrored my own. And in the quiet moments between chants and prayers, I caught the fragile blossom of something far deeper, a love that had grown in the shadow of war and hardship, delicate yet powerful, a tether binding two souls who had found refuge and strength in each other's arms. The scars we bore, hers from captivity and betrayal, mine from battles and loss, were not signs of weakness, but marks of resilience. And in the tribe's eyes, those scars became a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. The ceremonies stretched long into the night, the firelight casting flickering shadows that danced like ghosts of ancestors watching over us. And as the final words were spoken and hands were clasped in solemn vows of loyalty, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by a quiet peace and a fierce resolve to honor this new place I now called home. The tribe's embrace was more than symbolic. It was a living, breathing bond that promised protection, unity, and a future forged not just by blood, but by shared sacrifice and unwavering trust. Waya's hand in mine was steady and warm, a reminder that amidst the turmoil and loss, we had found a sanctuary not only in each other, but within a community that would stand as a shield and a strength for years to come. And as the dawn broke over the distant mountains, painting the sky with hues of gold and rose, I looked out over the faces of those who had once been strangers but were now family, knowing that my journey had led me here, not by chance, but by the quiet, unyielding force of love, loyalty, and the sacred bond that ties a heart to a tribe forevermore. The fragile peace we had fought so hard to reclaim felt like a thin veil stretched taut over a simmering fire. And just as the tribe began to breathe easier, rumors reached us that the mercenaries who had once hunted Waya had not been vanquished but were regrouping in the shadows, their cruel resolve hardened by failure and thirst for revenge. The attacks that followed were brutal, and swift guerrilla strikes in the dead of night, fires set to the outer villages, ambushes on supply lines that tested the tribe's vigilance and endurance, reminding us all that the wilderness was a harsh guardian, indifferent to the blood spilled beneath its ancient trees. In those tense days, Waya and I found ourselves leading patrols through the dense forests and rocky ridges, our senses sharpened by the ever-present threat, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sending ripples of tension through our bodies. And as we moved through the wild together, side by side, our bond deepened into something more profound than mere partnership, a silent understanding forged in shared danger and quiet moments of trust beneath the vast sky. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon us both, for we were not only protectors of a people and a land, but guardians of the fragile hope that still flickered despite the shadows that clung to the edges of our world. The nights were the hardest, the darkness filled with the unseen threats of lurking enemies and the whispered fears that gnawed at the edges of courage. Yet in those same nights, I found solace in Waya's steady presence, the fierce determination in her eyes, and the quiet strength that radiated from her, like the soft glow of embers ready to ignite a fire. Every patrol was a test of endurance and trust. And as we navigated the tangled paths and hidden clearings, I learned to read the subtle signs of danger alongside her: the broken twig, the disturbed earth, the distant howl of a wolf warning us to be cautious, and with each step, our connection grew, a lifeline in the wild uncertainty that surrounded us. Despite the constant threat, there were moments of peace that reminded us why we fought. The laughter of children playing near the river, the songs carried on the wind during sacred ceremonies, the simple joy of sharing a meal by the fire as the stars watched silently overhead. Those moments grounded us, fueling the resolve to protect not just a tribe, but a way of life that embodied resilience, honor, and an unbreakable bond to the land. And as the days bled into weeks, and the mercenaries' attacks became less frequent but no less deadly, I realized that the wilderness was both adversary and ally, a crucible that tested our limits and shaped us into something stronger, fiercer, and more united than we had ever been before. Beneath the ever-watchful sky, with Waya's hand clasped in mine, and the steady beat of tribal drums echoing in the distance, I knew that no matter how long the shadows lingered, the light of our courage and loyalty would never be extinguished, and together we would stand unyielding against whatever darkness the world dared to send. The chill of dawn barely touched the edges of the camp when the first whispers of betrayal began to curl through the air like smoke from a distant fire. Subtle but unmistakable signs that the enemy was no longer just beyond the trees, but had found a way to slip inside the very heart of the tribe. Suspicion fell like a shadow over the faces of those I had come to call family. And though the trust between us was strong, the seed of doubt planted by the traitor threatened to unravel everything we had fought for, with a slow, poisonous drip that crept into the cracks of our unity. I took it upon myself to uncover the truth, knowing that the cost of failure would be far greater than any danger I had faced in the wilds. For this was a battle not just of strength and courage, but of loyalty, and the fragile bonds that held a people together. Moving through the camp with quiet determination, I observed the subtle shifts in behavior, the furtive glances, the whispered conversations that fell silent when I approached, the small inconsistencies in stories told around the fire, and piece by piece, like tracking game through dense underbrush, I followed the trail of deceit until the identity of the traitor became clear, a bitter blow that cut deeper than any arrow could. For it was betrayal born, not of fear or necessity, but of greed and envy. Confronting the betrayer was a moment suspended between dread and resolve, a test of everything I had learned about honor and justice in the wilderness, and the strength born of belonging. Waya stood by my side, her fierce gaze a steady flame that bolstered my courage, even as the weight of the moment threatened to crush me. And in that unspoken solidarity, I felt the full measure of her faith in me, and the resolve it gave to protect this new family that had become my world. The confrontation rippled through the tribe like a stone cast into still waters, shaking the foundations, but ultimately purifying the bonds that bound us. And though scars would remain, the truth brought with it a renewed sense of purpose and an unshakable commitment to stand united against any threat, internal or external. In the days that followed, the tribe gathered beneath the wide, watchful sky, their voices rising in songs of healing and strength that echoed through the mountains and valleys, a chorus that reminded us all of the resilience forged through struggle and the power of forgiveness tempered by justice. As I walked among my people, feeling their eyes meet mine with renewed trust and the fierce pride of a community that had faced the darkest shadows and emerged stronger, I knew that this battle, like the many before it, was part of a larger journey, one that would test us but never break us. And with Waya's hand firmly clasped in mine, her fierce spirit and unwavering belief in what we had built together, I understood that no betrayal, no matter how deep, could sever the bonds forged in fire and loyalty, and that together we would face whatever storms lay ahead, unyielding and unbroken beneath the vast, enduring sky. Standing side by side beneath the broad sky that stretched endlessly above our homeland, Waya and I felt the weight of all we had endured settle gently upon our shoulders. A mantle of responsibility that neither of us took lightly, but both bore with quiet pride, knowing that the battles fought and sacrifices made had transformed not only us, but the tribe we now led with steadfast hearts. The scars etched into our flesh and spirits were badges of honor, reminders of a past filled with pain and struggle, but also the crucible that forged a unity stronger than any enemy's blade, a bond woven from resilience, trust, and the fierce love that had grown between us like the ancient trees that stood sentinel over these lands. Our story had become a beacon to those around us, a living testament to the power of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. And as we watched the faces of the tribe's young warriors, eyes bright with determination and hope, we knew that our greatest victory was the legacy we were shaping. One not written in bloodshed alone, but in the lessons of endurance, loyalty, and the unyielding spirit of a people bound to the earth and to each other. With every lesson shared around the firelight, every skill passed from seasoned hands to eager youth, we prepared the next generation not just to defend their homeland, but to honor the heritage that had sustained us through centuries of hardship and change, instilling in them a deep reverence for the sacred bond between land and life that was the heart of our culture. There were moments when the past pressed in, the ghosts of betrayal and loss, whispering warnings on the wind. But in the strength of the community we had rebuilt and the steady hand of Waya clasped in mine, I found a calm certainty that we were ready for whatever storms the future might bring. Our leadership was not defined by titles or power, but by the example we set, a quiet strength born from struggle, a compassion rooted in shared pain, and a vision of a future where every child could grow free and proud beneath the vast sky. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with hues of gold and fire, I felt a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought me here from the harsh wilderness where I had found a broken captive to this place of hope and renewal, where love and courage intertwined to create a new path forward. Waya's fierce spirit was a constant flame beside me, her faith in our people and in me, a source of strength that no enemy could extinguish. And as we stood watching the young faces eager to carry the torch, I understood that this was the true meaning of legacy, not just survival, but the passing of a light bright enough to guide generations through whatever darkness might come. And in that moment, beneath the enduring sky and the steady rhythm of the earth beneath our feet, I knew that together we had forged something eternal, a family, a tribe, and a promise that the courage of our hearts would live on forever. Years have folded into years since that moment when I found Waya, broken and chained beneath the merciless sky, and as I sit now beneath the vast expanse of the same endless heavens, watching our children play with the wild freedom that once seemed impossible, I am struck by the quiet miracle that a single act of mercy can ignite a mercy born not of weakness, but fierce courage that forever altered the course of my life. I think back to the weight of that night, the ache of her body against mine as I cut those chains, and how neither of us could have foreseen the journey that would follow, one that carried us through pain, betrayal, and war, forging a bond deeper than blood, tempered by fire and forged in the crucible of survival. The tribe that once viewed me with suspicion now surrounds me with a fierce loyalty that humbles and steadies me, a family bound not just by shared bloodlines, but by the unyielding spirit of love and protection that courses through our veins like the rivers carving these lands. Waya's strength, once born of captivity and suffering, has blossomed into a fierce flame that lights our path forward, and her faith in me has become the cornerstone of a life built on trust, respect, and the unbreakable promise to stand together against whatever darkness threatens our home. Each day I witness the profound resilience of a people whose history is etched into the earth itself. Their songs, their ceremonies, and their fierce commitment to one another. And I am reminded that my role is not merely as protector, but as part of a living legacy that honors the past while shaping the future. Our children, running beneath the wide sky with laughter and light in their eyes, carry the hopes and dreams of generations, and in their joy, I find the quiet victory that makes every hardship, every scar, and every sacrifice worthwhile. The wilderness around us remains a harsh and untamed guardian, but within its vast embrace, we have found a sanctuary, built not on solitude, but on belonging, on the fierce love that binds hearts and souls together through the darkest nights and the brightest dawns. As the sun dips low and paints the horizon with hues of fire and gold, I am filled with a deep gratitude for the unexpected path that began with a simple choice to offer compassion in a world that often demands cruelty, and that choice has blossomed into a life richer and more profound than I ever dared. Imagine, I am no longer a solitary wanderer, but a man embraced by a tribe whose fierce loyalty would see me through any storm, whose love is as vast as the sky above and as enduring as the land beneath our feet. And in this bond forged by blood and spirit, I have found my true home, my unshakable strength, and the enduring promise that even in the wildest places, mercy and love can create a legacy that outlasts time itself.